that was the end of her. Next morning the constable passed that way, and you may fancy he could scarce believe his eyes when he saw the golden hut shining and glistening away in the copse. But he was still more astonished when he went in and saw the lovely maiden who sat there. To make a long story short, he fell head over ears in love with her, and begged and prayed her to become his wife. "Well, but have you much money?" asked the Mastermaid. Yes, for that matter, he said, he was not so badly off, and off he went home to fetch the money, and when he came back at even, he brought a half-bushel sack, and set it down on the bench. So the Mastermaid said that she would have him, since he was so rich, but they were scarce in bed before she said she must get up again. "For I have forgotten to make up the fire." "Pray don't stir out of bed," said the constable, "I'll see to it." So he jumped out of bed, and stood on the hearth in a trice. "As soon as you have got hold of the shovel, just tell me," said the Mastermaid. "Well, I am holding it now," said the constable. Then the Mastermaid said, "God grant that you may hold the shovel, and the shovel you, and may you heap hot burning coals over yourself till morning breaks." So there stood the constable all night long, shovelling hot burning coals over himself, and though he begged, and prayed, and wept, the coals were not a bit colder for that; but as soon as day broke, and he had power to cast away the shovel, he did not stay long, as you may fancy, but set off as if the evil one, or the bailiff, were at his heels. And all who met him stared their eyes out at him, for he cut capers as though he were mad, and he could not look in worse plight if he had been flayed and tanned, and every one wondered what had befallen him, but he told no one where he had been, for shame's sake. Next day the attorney passed by the place where the Mastermaid lived, and he too saw how it shone and glistened in the copse. So he turned aside to find who owned the hut, and when he came in and saw the lovely maiden, he fell more in love with her than the constable, and began to woo her in hot haste. Well, the Mastermaid asked him, as she had asked the constable, if he had a good lot of money, and the attorney said he wasn't too badly off, and as a proof he went home to fetch his money. So at even he came back with a great fat sack of money, I think it was a whole bushel sack, and set it down on the bench, and the long and the short of the matter was, that he was to have her, and they went to bed. But all at once the Mastermaid had forgotten to shut the door of the porch, and she must get up and make it fast for the night. "What, you do that," said the attorney, "while I lie here? That can never be. Be still while I go and do it." So up he jumped like a pea on a drumhead, and ran out into the porch. "Tell me," said the Mastermaid, "when you have hold of the door latch." "I've got hold of it now," said the attorney. "God grant then," said the Mastermaid, "that you may hold the door, and the door you, and that you may go from wall to wall till day dawns." So you may fancy what a dance the attorney had all night long, such a waltz he never had before, and I don't think he would much care if he never had such a waltz again. Now he pulled the door forward, and then the door pulled him back, and so he went on, now dashed into one corner of the porch, and now into the other, till he was almost battered to death. At first he began to curse and swear, and then to beg and pray, but the door cared nothing but holding its own till break of day. As soon as it let go its hold, off set the attorney, leaving behind him his money to pay for his night's lodging, and forgetting his courtship altogether, for, to tell the truth, he was afraid lest the house door should come dancing after him. All who met him stared and gaped at him, for he too cut capers like a madman, and he could not have looked in worse plight if he had spent the whole night in butting against a flock of rams. The third day the sheriff passed that way, and he too saw the golden hut, and turned aside to find out who lived there, and he had scarce set eyes on the Mastermaid before he began to woo her. So she answered him as she had answered the other two. If he had lots of money she would have him; if not, he might go about his business. Well, the sheriff said he wasn't too badly off, and he would go home and fetch the money, and when he came again at even, he had a bigger sack even than the attorney. It must have been at least a bushel and a half, and put it down on the bench. So it was soon settled that he was to have the Mastermaid, but they had scarce gone to bed before the Mastermaid said she had forgotten to bring home the calf from the meadow, so she must get up and drive him into the stall. Then the sheriff swore by all the powers that should never be, and, stout and fat as he was, up he jumped as nimbly as a kitten. "Well, only tell me when you've got hold of the calf's tail", said the Mastermaid. "Now I have hold of it", said the Sheriff. "God grant", said the Mastermaid, "that you may hold the calf's tail, and the calf's tail you, and that you may make a tour of the world together till day dawns." Well, you may just fancy how the Sheriff had to stretch his legs. Away they went, the calf and he, over high and low, across hill and dale, and the more the Sheriff cursed and swore, the faster the calf ran and jumped. At dawn of day the poor Sheriff was well nigh broken winded, and so glad was he to let go of the calf's tail that he forgot his sack of money and everything else. As he was a great man, he went a little slower than the attorney and the constable, but the slower he went the more time people had to gape and stare at him, and I must say they made good use of their time, for he was terribly tattered and torn after his dance with the calf. Next day was fixed for the wedding at the palace, and the eldest brother was to drive to church with his bride, and the younger, who had lived with the giant, with the bride's sister. But when they had got into the coach, and were just going to drive off, one of the trace pins snapped off, and though they made at least 3 in its place, they all broke, from whatever sort of wood they were made. So time went on, and they couldn't get to church, and every one grew very downcast. But all at once the constable said, for he too was bidden to the wedding, that yonder way in the copse lived a maiden. "And if you can only get her to lend you the handle of her shovel with which she makes up her fire, I know very well it will hold." Well, they sent a messenger on the spot, with such a pretty message to the maiden, to know if they couldn't get a loan of her shovel which the constable had spoken of, and the maiden said yes, they might have it. So they got a trace pin which wasn't likely to snap. But all at once, just as they were driving off, the bottom of the coach tumbled to bits. So they set to work to make a new bottom, as best they might, but it mattered not how many nails they put into it, nor of what wood they made it, for as soon as ever they got the bottom well into the coach, and were driving off, snap it went into 2 again, and they were even worse off than when they lost the trace pin. Just then the attorney said, for if the constable was there you may fancy the attorney was there too, "Away yonder in the copse lives a maiden, and if you could only get her to lend you 1/2 of her porch door, I know it can hold together." Well, they sent another message to the copse, and asked so prettily if they couldn't have the loan of the gilded porch door which the attorney had talked of, and they got it on the spot. So they were just setting out, but now the horses were not strong enough to draw the coach, though there were 6 of them. Then they put on 8, and 10, and 12, but the more they put on, and the more the coachman whipped, the more the coach wouldn't stir an inch. By this time it was far on in the day, and everyone about the palace was in doleful dumps. For to church they must go, yet it looked as if they should never get there. So at last the Sheriff said, that yonder in the gilded hut, in the copse, lived a maiden, and if they could only get the loan of her calf, I know it can drag the coach, though it were as heavy as a mountain. Well, they all thought it would look silly to be drawn to church by a calf, but there was no help for it, so they had to send a 3rd time, and ask so prettily in the king's name if he couldn't get the loan of the calf the Sheriff had spoken of, and the Mastermaid let them have it on the spot, for she was not going to say no this time either. So they put the calf on before the horses, and waited to see if it would do any good, and away went the coach over high and low, and stock and stone, so that they could scarce draw their breath. Sometimes they were on the ground, and sometimes up in the air, and when they reached the church, the calf began to run around and around it like a spinning jenny, so that they had hard work to get out of the coach and into the church. When they went back it was the same story, only they went faster, and they reached the palace almost before they knew they had set out. Now when they sat down to dinner, the prince who had served with the giant said that he thought they ought to ask the maiden who had lent them her shovel handle and porch door and calf to come up to the palace. "For," said he, "if we hadn't got these 3 things, we should have been sticking here still." Yes, the king thought that only fair and right, so he sent 5 of his best men to the gilded hut to greet the maiden from the king, and to ask her if she wouldn't be so good as to come up and dine at the palace. "Greet the king for me", said the Mastermaid, and tell him, if he's too good to come to me.